Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and state up front, we are a customer of Sauce Labs, so I can actually answer some questions about the mobile testing and some of the other things that they're going to talk about and how well it's worked out. And I am very opinionated. I hope I'm not too confrontational in some of my slides. Almost everything I'm talking about I've either experienced at Lookout or at the company that I worked with a few years ago with Adam, who went on to help co-found Sauce Labs, a company called Slide, where we tried to do exactly this same thing, and we failed miserably. But at Lookout, fortunately, we have not failed yet. So yeah, I work at Lookout Mobile Security. We're up in San Francisco. Kind of our flagship product is an Android application. But the majority of the work that I do, Gene does, and a lot of the people on my team is all Ruby stuff on the back end. So behind every sort of Android installation of Lookout or iPhone installation of Lookout, there's a web application, there's analysis work, there's data storage, there's a huge sort of server backend arm to all of that. And what I'm really going to be talking about today is more the web presence. When you lose your phone, if you're not familiar with Lookout, you log into mylookout.com and you go find your phone, make it scream. You can lock your phone, wipe your phone. All of these things that, if you've lost your phone, need to work. And so that's kind of the angle that I have for Selenium in regards to what we're doing. But I should also be upfront in saying I don't work in QA. I've never worked in QA before. I've never worked for anybody in QA. I'm one of those dirty app developers that doesn't write enough tests. And yeah, I'm not going to, because Gene's here and I work with him, I don't want to be too upfront with what I do or don't do at the office. So with regards to Selenium, I want to kind of explain why I care. And as an app developer, I care a lot about the quality of the application because the user experience matters to me. My ultimate goal as an app developer is to provide a good user experience, a good flow for users. And when you're talking about something that's a safety net sort of application or utility like Lookout is, that has to work. It's absolutely important that a user's experience with the web product, even if we make minor changes here and there, is rock solid when they need us. Otherwise, we betray that sort of user trust relationship we've worked so hard to build. That's my ethos, I guess, on quality. And now, I guess, into the Selenium parts. This whole project, this sort of integrating after the fact, is about a year old at this point. And we've learned quite a bit in a year, and we've made a huge amount of mistakes. But at the very beginning of this project, we still have a large ball of mud Rails application. Very, very large Rails application that does a lot of things for users when they log in and interact with it, a lot of complex user flows, a lot of functionality floating around, and no browser testing. No, a lot of things, but that's the big takeaway, is that we started from scratch and we had to go from 0 to having pretty good test coverage in short order. Is we decided as a company that the state of affairs was no longer tenable. The Selenium integration and working on browser testing was one part of a larger kind of story in Lookout engineering around doing releases more frequently with higher quality, less regressions, and making sure that we could turn product around and get something from the drawing board into production, into users' hands as quickly as possible. And that's where we started. And there are a huge amount of challenges that we faced along the way. The first naturally being we had no browser tests at all. If you've worked with a Rails application, a lot of what people start with are kind of the simple unit tests, some integration tests, and then functional tests. In Rails parlance, functional tests are typically something that pretends to do a web request, and if you're like 99% of Rails developers, you just assert that 200 was responded. And that was the kind of extent of our user experience testing at the time. We also had no sort of browser testing infrastructure. We had a few automation hooks into the application to provide sort of you know, if you poke this URL, that'll create a user for you. If you poke this URL, that'll create a device for you. But outside of that, we had no machines to run browser tests on. We had headless Linux VMs. And actually, around the same time that we started this project, we really didn't have a very exposed CI server. This actually came around the same time when we installed Jenkins and became very serious about our test automation. But when we started, we had none of this. So we had to answer questions like, where do these tests run? What do they run against? Where do results go? And things like that. Drink some water real quick. From the team perspective, we, like most Rails shops, I think to Rails' credit, we had tests. Like there's a good amount of libraries being tested and underlying controller code models, things like that being tested. And that was good, but the entire attitude around how the team approached testing was very much developer-focused. Titus and I were talking a little bit earlier about Cucumber and RSpec and acceptance test-driven development, and these weren't things we were using at the time. We focused purely on testing for developer's sake. And when you talk about the difference between acceptance tests and unit tests, I view as a developer, unit tests are there to prevent past me from screwing over future me and making my own life easier. Whereas acceptance tests are there to make sure that when we say our application is going to do X, Y, and Z, that we can ensure with every release or a deploy or any change that X, Y, and Z still happens. And so we kind of had to change the mindset within the server team around focusing not so much just on our own little world of unit tests and what we can do there, but also thinking about how users engage with things and what's the actual feature that this large stack of code supports. We also had a pretty big lack of experience. I undertook a similar project at Slide with Adam that was a failure, and I was probably the most experienced engineer on the server team that did this, that had any experience with browser testing, and I wasn't all that good at it. And so we didn't have anyone who could stand up and say, that's the right direction, that's where we're going to go. And we kind of had to figure that out ourselves, which turned out to be pretty challenging. When you look at an application that's, at the time, I think it was 2.5, 3 years old, with tens of thousands of lines of code, and say, all right, we need to test this, and we need to test this well. There's a little bit of a, I think it's called the paradox of choice. I don't remember what the exact phrase is, but we're so concerned that we're going to choose wrong that we're almost paralyzed in which direction we should go. When I worked at Slide with Adam, some of the things that we did, I knew we shouldn't do again. Things like having QA being the sole keepers of test code, like having Selenium being owned just by QA. So we did start off moving towards developers being involved in this process and making sure that everyone could understand the reasons why we were doing things and where we were going with it. But other than that, we didn't know too much about where the landmines were, which is what I get to talk about today. So that was the beginning of the project and all of the challenges we had faced and the discussions we had. And so now I want to talk about the actual implementation of this as a project and where we went wrong and where I think we did something well. And I'm going to present this. I wanted to avoid being too preachy or prescriptive in how you should be implementing these things, because we had very kind of set goals around what we wanted to do. We wanted to be able to deploy more quickly. We didn't necessarily need everything to be tested as soon as possible. We kind of backfilled things as we went along, but it might change from organization to organization. So I'm just going to say this is what didn't work or I think was a bad idea for our organization and what was a good idea. It may be a little bit different for you. So the first huge bad idea, if any of you ever watched Animaniacs, this was a pretty common theme. QA should never own Selenium testing. I think it's really valuable that QA owns the infrastructure, the setting up of machines or maintaining sort of an automation layer. But if QA is the sole owner of the test framework and the tests that are written in it, then developers will never get engaged, and you always have kind of tests lagging behind the actual implementation. This actually comes from Slide. This was probably the biggest reason that that project failed at Slide. The corollary good idea for that is that Selenium tests should be moved up to the developer, as close to the developer part of the funnel as possible. If you can talk about how the tests are going to be written, or what the actual steps that a user is going to go through with the developer when they start implementing, then Selenium testing and how this plays out in the browser is top of mind, and you can actually prevent bugs from happening in the first place because developers will ask questions a lot, and you'll have a sense of where you're going and why. Another bad idea, and this is something that I've done, and I've regretted it when I've done it, is having your spinning up of a local server kind of tied into your test framework. It's really useful when you're developing locally to say, when you run, in my case, Ruby some test, that it spins up the Rails application and it spins up the Selenium WebDriver and it runs the test against that. And if that's how integrated your application is into your tests, then you can never do things like parallelization, or running on multiple stages at the same time and pointing your test at multiple hosts. So making sure that your tests can run locally is that's very, very important to get Selenium integrated into the developer workflow. But binding it to a local server or a local Rails application means you'll never be able to take advantage of Selenium Grid or Sauce Labs, or getting test times down to minutes instead of hours. If you're scaffolding up your app server every time you run a Selenium test, then what that means is, as your test base grows, as you start to support your entire application, your test run goes from 15 minutes to 30 minutes to 3 hours. I think our longest test run before we started to get serious about parallelizing things was around 2.5 or 3 hours. And when you start talking about doing Selenium tests in 3 hours, developers don't care anymore. If you can't tell me whether my change or what I'm doing is successful in less than 10 minutes, I'm not going to care. That's my inner app developer. I just don't care. If you can't tell me fast enough, I'm going to forget about it and move on to something else. So making sure that you can run things locally is very important, but also being able to run against any arbitrary app host. This can also come in very handy once you start to deploy to production. If you can then point your Selenium test at production, then you can start to close the loop on your deployment to say, we developed things, we went through, we deployed, all of our acceptance tests are passing against production. This was a good deployment. Let's all go have a beer. This is where the opinionation is going to start to come out. I think it's a terrible idea to use the same tool that you write your unit tests in for Selenium testing. And the reason I think this is a bad idea is because in our implementation at Lookout, it turned out that we would write, sorry, my slides are out of sync. We would write unit tests, and this is Ruby. We would write unit tests that actually drove the Selenium browser. And so this is from our Git log, to where if you look at this middle method, you kind of have an idea of what's supposed to be going on here, but it's, as far as the developer's focus, and there's a lot of stuff that I had to cut out for obvious reasons because it wouldn't fit, you're writing a unit test. You aren't thinking about what the user is actually interacting with, to where when you write a unit test that drives the Selenium WebDriver, it's good to make sure, it will help make sure that nothing regresses, but it won't tell you what this is actually ensuring from the user perspective. And this is where Titus and I will disagree on some number of things, and why I'm a big fan of tools like, oops, I'm skipping ahead. Tools like Cucumber. Cucumber's not a bad idea. I'm going to jump back to this. Tools like Cucumber, or something that can help you enumerate your Selenium test as an acceptance test as opposed to a unit test. When I context switch between Cucumber and RSpec, or Cucumber and test unit, which is what this is, then there's a very clear context switch for me as a developer that now I'm focusing on my models, my controllers. This is the code that I'm working on underneath things. And then when I switch over to Cucumber, I'm focusing on how is the user coming through and interacting with this site? And to me, that's the most important part about Selenium testing, is doing things as if you are the user, putting yourself or putting the test in their shoes and stepping through something. Another bad idea is anyone here a big fan of Selenium IDE or Celanese? Sweet. All right, then I'm going to bash the hell out of it, because we also started with the Selenium IDE because we were entranced. We were like, great, I can just step through all of these flows, record, and I can check in stuff that looks like this, and no one's ever going to touch it again. This is actually the smallest Celanese file I could find in our Git history. And the largest, I think, was 3,000 or 4,000 lines of HTML. And if you're not familiar with Celanese, it's basically the output from the IDE, and it's an HTML table of commands, arguments, and expected results. And it's like, people joke about Perl being like write once, read never. Celanese beats it so bad. Like, no one ever edited this. This was checked in once and forgotten about. And as your product changes, if you have to go in and rebuild your Selenium tests, then you're not going to do it. I think the Selenium tests need to evolve with the product, and doing something like this means you will never evolve this test. In our case, you would just delete it. I really think, ooh, this didn't fit well at all. That's a G. Using a tool for more suited for the acceptance test job, like JBehave or Cucumber, makes a lot of sense to me. But a bad idea, and there's a lot of debate around Cucumber in particular, because it's been used for very, very bad things. And this is terrible Cucumber. And I want to explain why this is terrible Cucumber. And Cucumber as a tool kind of gives you an English or German, like you can use any language on top of it, but it gives you this sort of basic descriptive plain text format for specifying something. But in this case, given I'm a free user, when I visit the login page and I enter my password and I enter my email, when I click on the login button, then I should click on the missing device link, then I click on the locate link, or blah, blah, blah. I'm not even going to bother reading this. This is describing a very, very specific user flow and how the underlying test is going to interact with the page directly. And if you're doing this, then you're not getting anything from Cucumber. You're just wasting people's time. And this is by far, when people talk about Cucumber sucking or being bad, this is generally what they're talking about, because there's so much Cucumber out there that is just, there's nothing to be gained from this. You're just adding another layer of indirection that's going to piss me off. But I think using Cucumber as it's supposed to be used is a really good idea. And the underlying philosophy as Cucumber is to kind of describe the application in a shared sort of language between you know, the engineering team, the QA team, maybe product managers or product owners. And in terms of describing and agreeing upon what you're going to build in sort of a common language, I think it can be very valuable there. And so here's that same sort of end result of making sure that we can log in and see specific things, done well in Cucumber. Given I'm a logged in free user, when I visit the missing device page, then I should be able to locate my phone, and then I should be able to screen my phone. And from a reader's perspective, you could not know anything about Lookout, but this tells you what this sort of functionality is supposed to be doing. And there's also, because Cucumber's oriented around you sort of defining this common language, there's an interesting sort of semantic bit here. Then I should be able to is code, at least in our terms, that we're not going to exercise the locate functionality. We're not going to exercise the screen functionality, but it should be there. And you know, this could be just checking that a button's on the page. This could be checking that a button's on the page that I can click that button, or that it's on the page, I can click it, and some JavaScript event is fired or something else. Just stating that I should be able to means, it could mean a lot of things in terms of the actual implementation, but from the reader's perspective, just means that a free user has this ability. And this can be backed very easily by Selenium, and this is what we actually do for a lot of our Selenium test cases, if you will, at Lookout. We have some of the older, terrible kind as well. I've been trying to cull those out slowly, But this is where everything that's moving forward is heading to. Not necessarily along those same lines, but still while we're kind of descending into the bowels of Selenium and Selenium testing, I'm a Ruby developer. Lookout's a Ruby shop. I don't think you should ever really be using the Selenium WebDriver API directly. And this is another one of those strong, maybe controversial opinions. As a Ruby developer, there's better abstractions for me to interact with a browser. Accessing the driver directly means that any changes to the WebDriver API will break me, but it also means I'm then bound to Selenium, which I don't want to be. There are some things that are going to be faster to run in a headless browser, like a headless WebKit or rack test, which isn't a browser at all, it just kind of pretends to be. But if I tie all of my tests or all my abstraction layers into the Selenium WebDriver API, then I've got no freedom to move to something when, if I don't need JavaScript or I don't need a full Selenium session, then I can't just go use something else that better suits the test that I'm trying to run. So a lot of, when I talked about our test unit stuff, not using an acceptance test-oriented tool, we're also using the Selenium driver API directly, and it led to really sort of long and really just terrible tests, just stuff that was overly complicated. A lot of this find element stuff, just a lot of what we would be doing is just actually making sure that we had a reference to all the objects on the page that we would need, and then poking at them in various ways. And if you're a Ruby developer, it's a really good idea to use a tool called Capybara. And Capybara sits in front of a library called Capybara WebKit, which can actually run things headless. It's really good for sort of local, rapid, iterative development. Rack tests, Selenium driver. I think there's one or two others, but it gives you sort of a uniform abstraction to interacting with a page. The page is going to be the same regardless of what driver you're actually using. And so in this case, instead of driver.navigate to, I can just say visit this URL. Instead of finding elements or finding form elements, stuffing stuff into them, I can call FillIn, and it's going to work on rack test, it's going to work on Selenium, it's going to work in Capybara WebKit. And I can build out APIs that use Capybara to do this, and I don't have to bind myself to any one particular tool besides Capybara. This kind of leads me to my next point, that you should be building an automation library. So let's take, this is kind of a pared down example of what a step definition for Cucumber. We've got an automation API that we're going to hit that's going to give us a user object. We want to hit a user and then do things with it. But this bottom part, we're really just hitting the login page, adding information into a form and submitting that. And we're going to want to use that for a lot more scenarios or different ways we're going to want to get at that. And so abstracting that out into just a login method that just takes a user object that we have running around means we can then, instead of doing sort of rewriting everything, we can build sort of a uniform automation layer between either RSpec or Cucumber and the actual application itself. What I won't go too much into because I haven't seen it work in practice, and if anyone wants to explain to me or show me how the page object pattern really works, I've not actually found anything in my experience that I feel really good about. A lot of our interactions aren't necessarily around page views or kind of reusable components like you might have in an e-commerce site, for example. And I haven't found any good way to kind of abstract things out into the page object pattern that doesn't bind things too closely to the interface. So a lot of what we do is more abstracting things into these concepts that we have in the Lookout ecosystem. Concept of a user and doing things like logging in with a user, updating settings for a user, things like that will be abstracted out. But the actual interactions with different pages or different UI elements isn't as well abstracted out. So that's one of the challenges going forward that I haven't really found out a good way for us to do that. If you are using Cucumber, and another way that you can do Cucumber very terribly, and this we do, and it's the worst thing, it's the biggest problem we have right now, is reusing Cucumber steps within other Cucumber steps. And it works, and it shouldn't work. This is a terrible idea. And I know now why it's a terrible idea. I actually am responsible for adding this into the code base, and I've regretted it ever since. Instead of building an automation library, let's just reuse the same steps. We wrote them already. We'll just call them again. What this leads to when you start to scale things out is just an intertwined mess of poorly defined interfaces and steps with plain English that aren't really useful if you're trying to reuse things across different sort of step definitions. And so this is actually a kind of clean, simple example of this. What happens when this scales out, say, I'm trying to think of how many steps we actually have. I think it's 120 or 130 different steps. What starts to happen is in Cucumber, you've got the step definition given regular expression block. We start to put a lot of optional parameters into the regular expression, and that passes arguments into the block, and then we'll manipulate that and pass those as optional parameters into other steps. And it's like building the stupidest API you've ever seen with English, and as a developer, it makes no sense. And it's it really bothers me that this is still a problem. We've spent a year building this, and it's one of the biggest downsides of both Cucumber, if you do it incorrectly, and Selenium at Lookout is we now have to contend with technical debt like this, and it's pretty painful. This is the part where I say good things about Sauce Labs. When we did things at Slide, we spent a lot of time, Adam and myself, setting up Selenium Grid, different Windows machines, provisioning them, making sure we had different versions of Windows and different versions of browsers on all of these machines, different Firefox machines, configuring those all in Jenkins. At this day and age, you don't do that. If you start out with that, then the time between you starting on this Selenium project and you having results to show to somebody that's paying bills is going to be much further apart. So using something like Sauce Labs or any other hosted service that exists, I think user testing might be the only one that really comes to mind, means you can get something up and running really, really quickly and have, every sort of starting from scratch project, you're going to have the one test. You start with the one test. Okay, make sure login works. If you've got an account with Sauce or something else to where you don't have to worry about setting up infrastructure, you make sure that that is the most successful, well-passing, always reliable test that you've got. And then you add another test, and then you've got two things, and that's really awesome and great. And then you add more tests, and the sooner that you can find regressions and be able to assuredly say, no, this wasn't a stupid Selenium error, or this wasn't a setup error, or the stage wasn't incorrect. The sooner you can say, we've caught real bugs and we've caught real regressions that we were just about to deploy into production, then all of a sudden Selenium becomes not a cost center, but part of what makes things go out faster is, wow, you just prevented support from getting hammered with requests on why I can't log in. So the less time you spend setting up your own infrastructure and just getting tests running, the better. I sort of skipped through the good idea. This is all. So I'm trying to keep a narrative in my head on what we're going through, because this is all very chronological for Lookout in my head, because we did this kind of mistake 1, mistake 2, mistake 3, mistake 4. The current mistake that we're on is running all of your tests against a single host. A lot of small companies tend to have like production, test environment, and local developer workstation. And so you'll be very tempted to say, all right, we're going to run all of our tests against the test environment. And that's cool when you're 5 people, but when you're 120 people, which is where Lookout is at now, and you have all of your tests from all of your different people hitting against this one host, if anything whatsoever happens to that host, there's a lot of people that are going to be pissed. Not necessarily a lot of people that are going to be pissed, there's a lot of tests that are going to then fail. Those tests are also going to take a really long time to run. If you take some amount of time to make sure that, all right, when you're 5 people, yes, you'll run against one test as you start to kind of build up your Selenium infrastructure. But there's got to be a tipping point to where you say, all right, we're no longer just going to focus on hitting test.mycompany.com with these Selenium requests. Instead, we're going to spin up machines on EC2 or spin up machines in Rackspace, and we're going to start saying anything in the billing suite is going to run against these hosts. Anything in the login or user suite is going to run against these hosts. And then you start to run tests in parallel, which means you're more resilient to failures on any one particular host, but you also get results faster. If you've got that one host that's the bottleneck, then you just reduce turnaround time, and it takes longer than 15 minutes to run your Selenium suite, and all of a sudden I stop listening because I'm an app developer, and that's what we do. I'm talking terrible about myself. My team is so much better than this. I'm the worst one there. So in the chronology, or in the sequence of things, also saving tests as sort of after the fact. When you develop something and you talk about it, you implement it, and then QA or even developers, and this is something that we had a difficult time when we started to backfill our test suite, was a developer would always add the test last. And so we've actually held we've held stuff back from being deployed because the developer hadn't written the Selenium test for it yet. And this is not necessarily bad because the tests are still getting written, but then you've stacked the deck against writing Selenium tests, because it's not, oh yes, we should really write Selenium tests, that's a good idea. It's Selenium is getting in the way of us shipping this new feature. Why Selenium, why? It also means your developers are incentivized to take shortcuts and write really shitty tests. If you incorporate some of that either alongside the actual development of a feature or upfront, then that means the tests will likely be better because someone's going to be running them as they develop something. But it's also Selenium or browser testing won't be blamed if something slips. And I think it's hard enough to sell Selenium to people who haven't yet seen the value of it, that anything that kind of, any chip that they can get to say, oh, well, this clearly isn't worth it, we haven't shipped this feature yet. Browser testing is just getting in the way of our development. We should not do this anymore. Anything that can help that narrative, you should avoid, because this is what actually killed our project at Slide, was we would wait until the very end of something, we'd write the tests, and then all executives, managers, product owners saw was browser testing getting in the way of our ability to be competitive. And that, if I could name one thing that really was the death knell to that project, it was the fact that everyone viewed it as an impedance as opposed to something enabling us to build new features and build them well. I'm totally out of sync now. This is terrible. I think there's been a really interesting trend in the past, at least at Lookout in the past couple years and across the industry of building web applications, to put more and more stuff into the browser itself. We've started to use Backbone really heavily, and we've got, most of my team is actually front-end developers now. And so there's a lot of people building very JavaScript-heavy applications. And if you rely on Selenium to test all the behavior in your JavaScript application, you're not going to get very good coverage, but it's also going to be very slow, and you're not going to have a lot of tests to do it. So using something like Jasmine or QUnit to actually test the JavaScript application, I think it's very important that you recognize as you start to build more these sort of rich front-end applications, that's a real application. JavaScript is no longer something that is polish on top of a static document. A lot of the application starts to live in JavaScript, and so it should be treated just the same, where you have unit tests focusing on these sort of library methods, models, controllers, things like that in JavaScript, and use Selenium to continue to do the acceptance testing around that. If you expect Selenium to meet all your needs in testing everything within a rich JavaScript or a rich front-end application, you're going to miss a lot of things, and you're going to spend a lot of time implementing stuff that could be much faster done in something like Jasmine. Oh, we're back to this now. Oh, no, we're back to good ideas. I added this slide in the car down because I forgot to talk about Jenkins and CI. As Ashley mentioned, I'm pretty big in the Jenkins project. When we first started, we didn't really have this sort of, a CI server wasn't central to our development workflow. And if Selenium is to become important to the developer workflow, it needs to be running in CI. In our setup, we use a tool called Garrett, and we pre-test all of our commits. And so getting Selenium into that Garrett workflow and making sure we're running Selenium tests as often as possible means we can start to identify ahead of time when a developer submits a commit. This commit breaks user login testing, or it breaks the account settings page, or things like that. And you can catch that closer to the developer themselves as opposed to way down the line when you're running some sort of automated nightly test everything job. And so we use Sauce Labs. We have our own internal OpenStack cluster to provide the actual test runners. And investing in Jenkins was one of the, or it doesn't have to be Jenkins for the record. investing in CI and integrating the Selenium workflow into CI was one of the things that really helped push us over the top and make this apparent to everyone within the company that this is something that's important, we're running it often, and we also, because Jenkins and a lot of other tools will give you good reporting, you can see when we started to break things and start to track down why things started to break. And so if you're doing any sort of retrospectives or reflecting on the work of a previous week or something like that, you can go in and say, well, we've been breaking a lot of stuff lately. Why has this stuff been breaking? And start to put more feedback into either developer practices, people taking shortcuts, or just missing test coverage, and kind of close that loop on the development workflow. I actually have no idea how I'm doing on time. I'm going to assume I've got, Ashley just waved at me, I've got plenty of time. I don't want to talk too much about sort of the specific Ruby stuff that we've done. I can answer any questions. I don't know how many people here are of the Ruby persuasion. But it's a lot of what we've done at Lookout. At Slide, we did a lot of Python, and we had our own unique troubles with that. But I'd like to just go ahead and jump into any questions, rock throwing, debating, etc.
Where you've got Capybara calling more Capybara, how are you going to fix that?
Do you mean the the cucumber calling Q? That's a really good question. I wish I had a good answer because we haven't solved this yet. This is a prevalent problem. What I've started to try to do is, there's a lot of things where we require a session. Like most of what you interact with our web property is logged in user stuff. And so at the very least, we've started to pull out a sort of generic user object that has various methods on top of it. The problem with fixing this and why it's been so difficult and why I have trouble answering this question is because every time I've gone in and I've tried to come at this from a different angle, I've immediately broken a lot of other tests. And it's really difficult to change this once you're already down the hole.
I hear you.
What we're starting to do now, and on my team in particular, we've started to move Cucumber up to the front of sort of the product development cycle, is we're starting to actually just create these abstractions fresh for those new tests. So instead of going back and fixing a bunch of stuff, my current plan of attack is we're gonna continue building new things, and we're gonna need to test them. All of this stuff was backfilling and getting us up to where we could say the current status quo is well tested. But there's still going to be new stuff. And for all the new stuff, we're not making this mistake. And I'm hoping at some point we can delete a lot of these bad tests once we get to the point to where we say, well, we've now superseded this version of, let's say, the Find My Phone page with this stuff that's now the Find My Phone presence. So all of these tests just go away. So instead of going back and refactoring this, I'm kind of hoping we move the product fast enough that all of this just gets deleted. But that's something that we're just now starting on. This has actually been like this for probably 6 or 8 months, and it's just gotten worse and worse and worse. This is a video game reference, but if you've ever played Katamari, where you just like roll this big sticky ball of crap around a globe, that's what this is. It's just we've been rolling it around and picking up, oh, we need, given I'm a logged in user with an Android phone and I'm a T-Mobile user, something like we just pick up this more functionality on top of it, and I'm hoping we just can throw it all away instead of trying to untangle it. I don't know. In a year, maybe I'll come down and give another talk, and I'll have a better solution.
Tell you how we're doing with it.
It's hard. It is hard. Yeah.
How do you handle regressions? So you're talking about, okay, Cucumber's great. You write your Gherkin story, and everyone's happy, and you everything playing, and then you deploy it, and sure enough, there's cases that you hadn't addressed. How do you handle or corner cases or regressions in production?
So I can tell you the way that the Cucumber people tell me I'm supposed to do things, and then I can tell you how we actually do it. So how it's advised that you do these things is when you deploy into production and you find that there's there is a blind spot when you're developing these scenarios, is you sit down in your retrospective and you say, did we miss functionality here, or did we just do a crappy job of describing the product we're building? Like, is this just something that we forgot, or should we be more verbose or kind of encompassing when we start to spec things out? What actually happens is we kind of go back and scramble and say, wait, what the hell is supposed to happen there? And then some poor guy has to go write more stuff and do things like this after the fact. And it's you mentioned edge cases. I'm still on the fence on whether edge cases should go into Cucumber at all. Like, so let's take the login example. If there's going to be an edge case around rate limiting, like if you log in and you do a crappy job of typing your email so many times per minute, we should just block you and say, slow down, partner, you're trying to log in too much, just for kind of defensive practices. I'm not sure if that really should be going in here. I don't know where that should live. Right now it lives in sort of Rails integration, or excuse me, Rails functional test land for us, where we have full access to the internal models and everything else. The difficulty with putting edge cases into something like Cucumber or wherever you're going to be writing your Selenium tests is if you're running your Selenium test against a remote host, you can't make those assumptions that, oh, I can just stub something out. The method that says, should we rate limit this user, I can't just stub that out like I can in a Rails functional test. And so I'm a little on the fence, and it's kind of a case by case of stuff that we really should, in terms of specifying the product in Cucumber, if that should be accounted for, or if it makes more sense just because we can do things like mocking and set up expectations, if that should go into your more kind of integration functional test suite. But yeah, we don't have a really good feedback loop for saying, we missed something, what does that mean for us now? And unfortunately, because we've spent so much time backfilling the existing product stuff, a lot of what we've been doing has been writing tests against the production version of the product. And that's fine, you're not really gonna miss anything because it's all out there and live. Where it starts to get interesting and we still have some ground to cover and figure things out is when we start specifying things up front or kind of write these tests in tandem with the actual feature development. Then what happens when we miss something and we get all the way to production and John, the CEO, says, wait, why is it doing this when I do this? And what happens then? That's really something we haven't completely closed off yet. Did that answer? Ish. I wish I had good answers. Please.
You have an example mentioned that it's a bad idea to directly use WebDriver in your test. So I have a question is how bad this is, because if you Google, let's say Android Selenium framework, all the example is like this. And also if you walk into a feature team or company where they don't have any tests, it's better, you mentioned it's better to have something. So can I understand that it's okay to start with something like this? As you get more mature, you can develop another abstraction?
For what we ended up doing is anything that was accessing the driver directly like this, we actually had to rip out anyways. We found it very difficult to migrate from this to start using the sauce kind of the sauce version of the Selenium WebDriver. It's really just a subclass, but there's some other things involved. And so what ended up happening is I spent a lot of time making sauce and all of our kind of hard-coded Selenium, or our direct Selenium WebDriver calls working well together. And it just became, for me, it became difficult to maintain. I totally agree, like anything is better than nothing. But I don't know what's available in, say, Java, for example. I don't know if it's really, if the Selenium WebDriver is the best thing to be using in Java. But in Ruby, Capybara is something that a lot of people use, recommend, and it's, when you talk about doing browser testing in Ruby, Capybara is almost always at the top of what people mention, with good reason. So I don't think it's like the absolute worst idea ever, but it's something that I found anything that we did in the IDE or anything that we did kind of direct on top of the WebDriver became difficult for us to maintain long term and grow the suite to where we just tossed it out entirely.
So shall I understand that if one day I submit our test on Source Lab, we need to block some time to migrate our code so that they can run?
Not necessarily. So I guess another thing to disclose, I actually maintain the Sauce Ruby gem now. When we started with this, the Sauce Ruby gem was very different. So a lot of the stuff that I learned when I kind of went through kind of coupling our tests to Sauce Labs led to direct improvements in the Ruby gem. The Java libraries and the Python libraries are actually much more mature than the Sauce gem was at the time. It's not terribly difficult. I think it was difficult for us because the Ruby gem was in the state it was in. It wasn't because just Selenium and Sauce Labs are incompatible. What actually happens when your tests are running is instead of using the Firefox driver or the Chrome driver, it uses the Selenium remote driver, which sends the same Selenium commands over the wire to a remote driver server, I guess, on the remote side. So it's Selenium end to end. There's just the state of the library support that we had at the time made this difficult. I think it would, like right now it would be much easier, but Capybara is now a dependency of the Sauce gem, so it's available, so you might as well use it if you're in Ruby. I can't really speak to too much else. But the thing that I think is important to keep in mind that this isn't necessarily difficult to work with or kind of to understand on its face, but when we start to talk about scaling up testing to the entire development team, I think it's impractical to say that every developer is going to need to understand the nuances of the Selenium driver API. And that's what this would require. With the Capybara DSL, it is more restricted. It's a little bit more of a subset of what you can do. You can actually get directly to the driver to do the things that Capybara itself doesn't support. But a lot of times what people really want to do is they want to find an element, they just use find. They want to visit a page, they just use visit. And they want to click on things, and they just use click. And you can get directly to this from Capybara, but for the developer team in general, it's a lot easier to say, here's the like 10 methods that you really need to know about in order to write tests successfully. And that's more of a people problem than a technical problem. If everyone on your team is well-versed in the driver API, then I don't see any problem with it. It would just be, Rails as a framework is already difficult enough to understand everything. I didn't want to add more complex APIs that everyone would need to understand to be effective in writing tests. Okay. I think there's a guy way back there. Yo.
Do you have any idea how many Sauce Lab minutes you use per production release?
Per production release. I actually don't know that per production. I could do the math if I could do math. So one of the things that we found out really early, and it was we'd maybe been running tests in CI before every deployment for a couple weeks before I called Adam and said, we've got to figure something out because we're about to use a crap ton of minutes. So we actually, the growth curve was like, we had an account and we went a few hundred minutes a week, and then we had 9,000 minutes a week or something like that, and then we had 18,000, and I think our high score at this point is in a month maybe 70-ish thousand minutes, and we do deploys at least once a day. So math that, and that's how many minutes we use up per production deployment. The approach that we've taken to, like, as much as I love giving my friends at Sauce money, the approach that we've taken is there's some set of tests which are in a lesser used path, and Cucumber and a lot of other test frameworks allow you to tag different test suites. And so per commit or per, like, to ensure that we're not going to screw up a deployment, we have a subset of tests that must be run. And the larger suite runs on a timer and doesn't run as frequently because, you know, older functionality, say supporting our older Windows Mobile or BlackBerry clients, which I think we've end of life, like stuff that tests that, we aren't changing often, and that can live in the sort of slow suite. So we don't run that too often. I'm not sure how much I can tell you about what we spend on Sauce. It's been worth it though. This is not a pitch. Like, it has been absolutely worth it to say to every developer. Like, we actually have, I think, 40 sub accounts in Sauce. Every developer has Sauce credentials. Every developer can run, now that they finally have Android stuff out, we can run tests in our mobile website, can run on the Android phone or on the Android emulator on top of Sauce Labs. Like, every developer has access to that. And that has been, that combined with not spending the money to build that internally, effectively the same thing, has made it, like, there's no one that questions using Sauce at Lookout right now. It's turned out to be a really good idea. I think Titus, you had a question.
Yeah, you mentioned Capybara. Have you had any experience or familiarity with Water as a DSL for WebDriver?
So back in the olden days when Adam and I were doing things, we looked at Water and using, I think the WebDriver, like, it was still Selenium 1 was the big thing then. WebDriver was very nascent at the time. We didn't go down the Water route just because we were a Python shop. At this point, I know there's I don't think it's been merged in, but there is a kind of Water Capybara gem, if I remember correctly. There's some Ruby Water thing. I don't know what the advantage of Water is anymore. At the time when Adam and I looked into it, it was because it supported IE way better than Selenium did. But now Selenium WebDriver does a really good job of hitting IE and manipulating it the way we want, to where when I found Capybara and everyone else I knew who was doing this in the Ruby community said, just use Capybara, I didn't really think about Water at that point.
I was just going to ask you in terms of workflow. So you actually have your developers coding, writing unit tests, writing Selenium tests.
Mm-hmm.
Before they're committing, they're spinning up a Sauce instance or whatever, and then testing against that, and then committing. Is that how that works for you?
They're supposed to be.
They're supposed to be. This is a huge problem for a lot of people who use Selenium. The last place I was at, they broke tests constantly because, one, the tests were going to a place that wasn't exactly matched up with the code commit, and two, they had no way to validate it when they checked it in. So
right.
It's just kind of like a...
So the reason I say that they should be, because it's a really difficult problem to solve. The way that, I've done a lot of talks about this before, but the way that Jenkins and Garrett integrates for us, and Garrett is our code review tool, is you push something up to Garrett, it triggers jobs in Jenkins, which test the thing and report back, and something can't be integrated into the code base until Jenkins tells Garrett this change is good. So that's for unit integration functional tests, stuff that doesn't need a server. The difficulty with, and why it's advised that developers run against Sauce, like hitting their local server, is because it turns out it's really difficult to deploy a stage, run tests against that stage from Sauce Labs, get results back in a sort of a rapid fashion. Like that's been the sort of goal on high where we want to go, to where we run all of our Selenium tests, or the important Selenium test per commit, but we really trust/hope that developers, because they all have Sauce credentials and they all have full access to Sauce, and there's, like, we've built a number of rake tasks into the code base to where a developer really just needs to run rake test Sauce, Chrome, Firefox, blah, 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 and then their feature file, and it will run and report back there. Like they don't need to go log into Sauce Labs or anything. We just use it as a runner. So they should be doing that. But going from you should to you must has turned out to be a really difficult problem because you have to have so many things for your actual application deployment correct. And for various reasons, at Lookout, that's turned out to be a very difficult task. So we say, you should really run these tests, and if something breaks Selenium tests, then Gene gets angry, and I get angry, and I go yell at somebody. But we don't have any way on guarding commits against Selenium test failures right now, because it's just super difficult to get there. But with something like, even if you're using Selenium Grid, you should be able to, at least in the Ruby world, you should be able to have local test results and everything, just like you would be running Cucumber locally. You should be having Cucumber test results locally. So I don't think it really matters that it's Sauce or not Sauce. It's just, depending on your local tooling, it should be feasible for developers to run that stuff, and then it just comes down to access management, capacity planning, and things like that. Any other questions I can? Go back there.
Actually, I think that, in my opinion, that piece of code is still salvageable if you have it connect to Sauce Lab. One of the ways is that to make a page object for that, and then instead of having the lines tightly coupled as a function, you may have it abstracted out as something like insert email info as a method, and then password field, yes, provide password field and the guest,
Right.
and then click button, and then eventually you have these methods call on your test.
So what turned out to be difficult with this when we were integrating the Sauce Lab stuff was we had to go to the superclass and the driver and do a lot of monkey patching in Ruby to get the behavior that we wanted. I totally agree with you that this is salvageable, and you can totally build page objects using the WebDriver API directly. The questions that come to my mind if you do that are kind of along the lines of what she was asking before, is does everyone who writes page objects now need to understand and be familiar with the Selenium API? Let's say that's a yes. All right, who's going to be in charge of those? If you go down that further, if there's a team of people who is familiar with building page objects and understands the infrastructure on the code side of things to write these tests, or actually to support writing these tests, to me, and this is my opinionation again, if that's not everyone that's going to be contributing code that faces users, then you'll start to create a rift in those who can write tests and those who can't, or those who don't have the time to. And my main focus on Capybara, like we still need to do better abstraction for our own Capybara stuff, but was just to make it simple enough and accessible enough to anyone who would be writing code. One of the mistakes we made at Slide was who owned these tests, and the test, like, I don't think it was called page objects back then, but the sort of abstraction for dealing with the driver directly, who owned that was strictly within QA, and no one else understood how the hell to work with it. And if you try to have someone explain how the hell it worked, it took way too long. And so I have a lot of concerns / reservations around making sure that the Selenium test code is accessible, or as accessible as possible for everybody. I don't think that this is bad on its face. I think the sort of, I guess, social or people consequences further, like 2 or 3 layers removed, are where it becomes troublesome. You had another question?
So I have a question about the percentage of Selenium tests. How many do you have in your company, like percentage-wise?
Percentage-wise, what's the denominator on the, like in terms of our code coverage, or?
No, not the code coverage. Since you mentioned it as part of a good idea is that user acceptance tests you tend to use Selenium, but you also made a comment saying that it's only for the UI validation that user is able to, but you don't really necessarily go to the back end and validate.
Correct.
Right? So that means you also answered another question saying that if you have boundary edge cases, you go to functional sleep. So I would like to know, in terms of number of tests you have, if you bad Selenium, functional, unit, like what's the percentage of it?
I don't know percentages, but in terms of unit functional and integration as a block, I think that's around 4,000. And then Selenium, I think we have 187 or 88 scenarios. Because we focus so heavily on Selenium, we actually are kind of lopsided right now, where unit tests get written and Selenium tests get written, but stuff like making sure that when you go through and do these kind of specific actions, that values are getting updated correctly in the database, we're actually spotty there. That's one of the other challenges when you start to backfill Selenium and go from 0 to a lot, is what else is kind of being neglected in that time period. And for us, a lot of it's come down to more like your model integration testing and making sure that whatever's driving the user experience, that underneath the actual data is valid and correct. And we're much spottier there because we focus so hard on unit testing to begin with, and more recently Selenium testing, that now we need to start kind of working towards the middle. But what's challenging to me is where those boundaries start to exist. For me, it's very clear from a unit test up. Like anything that's testing more than a method at a time, it's very easy for me to say, if it tests a method, that's a unit test. If it tests a couple methods, that's an integration test. If it tests browser behavior, that's a browser test, Selenium test, what have you. But when you start to talk about these more complex interactions, it becomes a little bit more difficult to say, should that be as part of the Selenium testing? Should we also do sort of database validations as part of while we're doing these things? Or should that live somewhere in the middle? Or should that be done kind of in integration testing? It's something I don't have a good answer for, but it's one of the things that's definitely top of mind for me right now, because it is spotty and it's...
How do you calculate the code coverage in Selenium?
I have no idea. I've never done it.
I'm trying to find out the answer. With that. Cool. So
I've seen people do that. I think
code coverage?
The way to do it is you run one Selenium test at a time. So you start the application with the code coverage package or whatever you do. Run one test, is single threaded, and then you check the coverage of that test. And then run another one. It's super time consuming.
The question that I kind of have for you is, what value does that give you? Like knowing you've got 50% code coverage from your Selenium tests, is that valuable?
No, the trick is that I want to know how many percentage is not tested.
Not tested. Fair enough. So I don't know what sort of environment you're working in, but in Rails land, there's so much stuff that's just magic made out of thin air in Rails. It's the most infuriating thing I've ever worked with. But methods just appear, and things just happen very sort of sleight of hand. So it's almost impossible for us to calculate that to some extent, because if you take a tool like Active Record, methods aren't like find by device ID is not a method. That's completely metaprogramming magic that provides that. So it would be difficult for us to calculate code coverage effectively for all of the variants of magic methods that appear throughout Rails. So it's something, instead of kind of paying attention to code coverage, we've kind of gone by gut feeling and how many regressions we have. Like if we get something out into production, we have at least an hour-long meeting afterwards to figure out how the hell that happened. And as we've sort of gone through this project along with a couple other things, what's happened is when we get into that room and we say, well, we just screwed up a deployment, what the hell happened? In the most recent cases, it's been a thread safety issue with a gem, which mind-blowing. I don't know how you test for stuff like that besides just being lucky, I guess. And then stuff that dealt with production data very specifically. And so we've gone through enough iterations of that to where instead of relying on these sort of metrics, we go kind of by gut feel of how confident do we feel in shipping this code. And for Selenium, it's been more about, at least for Find My Phone or these things that we've built, we now feel confident enough just shipping changes or shipping changes fairly rapidly, knowing that we've got good enough coverage to where if the core components of what we're doing break, we are going to know about it before we ship. If we find new things after we ship, then we go back to the retrospective and say, how the hell did this happen? And we start over again. Oops. Sorry.
Do you do data-driven tests?
No. Actually, do we do data-driven tests? I don't know. I don't know how much. I think we've done it before. I don't think there's anything that we've really done recently that's been, or I would classify it as data-driven. Yeah.
Do you mean by data-driven? Do you mean load test?
No, I mean like you have like username and password, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that username, that password.
Mm-hmm.
Is too short, too long?
Mm-hmm.
Different sets.
That probably would cover by unit test. So for the Selenium test, we do not probably not want to like, go through all those cases.
But what you want to test on Selenium is the error message that might appear.
Yeah, error message we'll test once. Yes, we'll test every error message. We probably test it at least once. We saw this error message in this case, but probably we're not trying to test all the cases.
Yeah, in a lot of the scenarios that we've written, it's been, we know that if we have this one sort of incantation, we should see this result, but we don't. I wouldn't say we've kind of come up with here, what if we put a bunch of data into this field, or what if we put a bunch of Unicode into this field and create a scenario or a test around that? Because we've started from like the flip side of an existing application, we all have a fairly good idea of where those bodies lie and where the problems are. And so we haven't gotten to the point, I don't think, to where we start to do more interesting, like throwing data into forms or just seeing where the application breaks. As this has matured, we've gotten to the point to where we're starting to talk about manual testers, bridging the gap between manual testers and automation, and finding a way for when they find these sort of regressions or issues with features that have been developed, how we bridge that gap to bring those into automated tests. That's something we haven't done a lot of because we backfilled everything. And we'll probably see within the next 6 months how that turns out for us.
You were knocking Selenium IDE earlier. They do have you can export stuff out as Selenium WebDriver, and you can create your own templates and stuff like that. But you were just talking about bridging the gap between manual testing and automated testing. So how do you do that? If there's no Selenium IDE or there's no tool like that, how do you do that? I'm assuming your manual testers aren't technical.
They are. We've actually, I've been really impressed with the requirements that we kind of set for QA engineers and people who are going to be doing some form of manual testing. They get, I think every single one of them can code, and they are expected some level of coding chops, but like they put people like me, app developers, in on those interviews, and if someone can't code, then they actually don't usually make it through. I think always don't make it through. At Slide, one of the problems that we had was exactly that. We would use a tool like the Selenium IDE, and we had non-technical testers who were going through it and checking the application and kind of running through manual test plans. And it is one of the, without technical testers, I don't know how you bridge that gap effectively, other than creating, if the IDE will export into some sort of more manageable format, then I could imagine having the more technically inclined or code-capable people on the QA team working with manual testers to bring those into the regular test suite. But I don't think there would be sort of a direct bridge between something like the IDE and a manual tester going through a test plan, recording it, exporting it, and checking it in directly to the tree. We've actually been talking about Robodium a lot lately, and what's kind of on the drawing board right now is a system like that where developers are going to focus on writing Robodium tests themselves for what they're developing, and then manual testers are going to focus on kind of when they run through test plans, making sure that they record it and export it in some format, and then either developers or the coders on the QA staff are going to need to find a way to bring those actually into the tree and incorporate them as part of the main test suite. We're kind of planning for 2 different test suites right now, though. One of stuff that's been recorded from test plans and ones that have been developer-driven that are probably going to be in 2 actually completely separate trees. But it is a challenge that I'm looking forward to us solving, because that's been the biggest problem with a lot of the sort of black box testers that I've worked with, is finding a way to get their work saved and added to the automation suite. But yeah, I think a middleman is what you would probably want, but I haven't done it yet. So I think if that's everything, you can find me on the internet if you have further questions. I'm going to be sticking around if you want to punch me in the face. And then I guess thank you for listening.